I am Sergeant Mara Whitfield, 27 years old, a U.S. Army combat nurse, and a single mother. 3 weeks ago at my younger sister's wedding, she grabbed the microphone in front of 200 guests and announced, "My sister's the family charity case, a soldier with no husband and a kid nobody asked for." The whole tent full of people burst out laughing. Then my own father leaned into his microphone and added, "At least the Army gave her something to do with her life." My mother just smiled and sipped her champagne. Sitting beside me, my 6-year-old daughter, Josie, grabbed my hand so hard her nails dug into my skin. She looked up at me with her eyes brimming, and she whispered, "Mommy, did I do something wrong?" I was seconds from carrying her out of that tent forever. But there was one person at that wedding who didn't laugh, and what he did next changed everything. Before I get into it, hit like and subscribe if you want to hear how this played out. Where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to where all of this actually started. I need you to understand something about my family before I tell you what happened under that reception tent, because none of it makes sense without the 12 years that came before it. I grew up in Millbrook, Connecticut, a town where the lawns are manicured within an inch of their lives, and everyone knows whose father made partner and whose didn't. My father, Richard Colby, was a hedge fund analyst who never made partner and resented every single person who did. My mother, Denise, filled that resentment with expensive dinners we couldn't quite afford and a running scorecard of who in the family was winning and who was losing. My younger sister, Brooke, was born 4 years after me, and from the moment she came home from the hospital, she was declared the winner. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it the way you'd read a fact off a chart. Brooke got the bedroom with the bay window. I got the room above the garage that smelled like gasoline in the summer and never fully warmed up in the winter. Brooke got dance lessons, tennis lessons, a car on her 16th birthday. I got a paper route and a promise that if I wanted a car, I could save up for one myself, which I did, dollar by dollar, scooping ice cream at the Millbrook Creamery until my hands cracked from the cold. I enlisted in the Army the week after I turned 18. I told everyone it was because I wanted to serve my country, and that part was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth is that I needed to be anywhere that wasn't that house, anywhere I could be judged by what I actually did instead of by comparison to a sister who never had to try. Basic training broke me down in ways I didn't know I could be broken, and then it built me into somebody I actually respected. I trained as a combat medic, then went on to become a licensed nurse, and I deployed twice, once to a forward operating base outside Kandahar, where I learned how to keep a 19-year-old private breathing with 2 fingers pressed against a wound that should have killed him in 90 seconds. You learn things about yourself in a triage tent that you can't unlearn. You learn that panic is a choice, and so is calm. You learn to read a room the way you'd read a set of vitals coldly, quickly, without letting your own fear cloud the numbers. I met Josie's father during my second deployment. His name doesn't matter much to this story because he made it clear early on that he didn't intend to matter much to hers. When I told him I was pregnant, he requested a transfer to a different unit within 2 weeks. I raised Josie alone from the very beginning, in a 1-bedroom on-base apartment with cinder block walls and a window unit that rattled all night. My parents did not fly out when she was born. My mother sent a card. Inside it said, in her looping handwriting, "Well, I suppose we'll make do." I kept that card in a shoebox for years before I finally threw it away, and I remember exactly how satisfying it was to hear it land in the bottom of the trash can. Brooke, meanwhile, met Trevor Ashcroft at a country club fundraiser when she was 22. Trevor came from real money, the kind of money that owns half a marina and doesn't talk about it. My parents treated Brooke's engagement like a national holiday. There were toasts at every family dinner. My mother started a Pinterest board titled Brooke's Big Day before Trevor had even proposed. I watched all of this unfold from a distance, first from Fort Bragg, then from a duty station in El Paso, raising my daughter on a nurse's Army salary, video calling my parents on Sundays, and getting maybe 4 minutes of actual conversation before my mother would ask to talk to Josie so she could show her something Brooke had just bought. When the wedding invitation arrived, it came in a thick cream envelope with gold foil lettering, and it did not include a +1 line for Josie. I called my mother to ask if that was an oversight. She said, and I remember this word for word, "Well, weddings really aren't for children, honey. We just thought it might be easier on everyone." Easier on everyone meant easier on Brooke's photographs. I almost didn't go. I sat on the edge of my bed with Josie's tiny hand-drawn wedding card. She'd made one for Aunt Brooke all on her own. A crayon drawing of two stick figures under a rainbow, and I thought about just mailing it and staying home. But something in me, some stubborn, leftover soldier's instinct, refused to let them write me out of my own family that easily. I decided we would go. I decided we would go together, and if this family wanted to look at my daughter and see an inconvenience, they were going to have to do it to her face. The wedding was held at a vineyard estate outside Charlottesville, all string lights and reclaimed barnwood and a guest list that ran past 200 names. I drove 12 hours from my current post at Fort Campbell with Josie asleep in the back seat most of the way, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. I wore my dress uniform. Not because I wanted to make a statement, though I understand now that it did make one, but because it was the nicest thing I owned and because, honestly, it made me feel like myself in a room where I already knew I'd feel like a stranger. Josie wore a yellow sundress she picked out herself and insisted on carrying her rabbit the whole ceremony. We were seated at table 19, tucked behind a support column near the service entrance to the kitchen tent, close enough that every few minutes a caterer would burst through the flap, carrying a tray of something, and the noise of clattering dishware would drown out whatever toast was happening at that moment. I understood the placement the second I saw it. It wasn't an accident. It was a message, the same message they'd been sending my whole life, just written this time in a seating chart instead of a bedroom assignment. Josie didn't understand any of it. She sat in her folding chair, swinging her legs, pointing out the string lights, asking me if this was what a princess wedding looked like. I told her it was close enough. The ceremony itself was lovely, if I'm being fair. Brooke looked beautiful. Trevor cried when she came down the aisle, and for a moment, I let myself feel something soft toward both of them, some old sisterly instinct that 12 years of comparison hadn't fully burned out of me. That softness lasted exactly through cocktail hour. Then came the reception, and the toasts, and the moment that split my life into before and after. My father stood up first, with his glass raised, made a joke about finally getting his youngest daughter off the family payroll, and the crowd laughed the easy, oiled laugh of people who've had 2 glasses of good wine and no reason yet to feel uncomfortable. Then my mother spoke about Brooke's natural grace, about how some daughters just have a shine to them, and I watched several relatives nod along, like they were hearing a truth so obvious it barely needed saying. Then Brooke took the microphone for her own toast, thanking her bridesmaids, thanking Trevor's parents for the vineyard venue, and then, almost as an afterthought, she said, "And, of course, I have to thank my big sister for coming all this way. She's stationed out at some base in Kentucky now, Army life. Very brave, very selfless." A ripple of polite applause. And then, and I will never forget the exact rhythm of her voice when she said it, like it was a punchline she'd been saving, she added, "My sister's basically our family's charity case at this point. A soldier, no husband, and a kid nobody exactly signed up for. But hey, somebody's got to be the cautionary tale, right?" The tent erupted. Not a nervous laugh, not an uncomfortable titter, a full rolling wave of laughter from 200 people in linen and pearls, glasses lifted, heads thrown back. My father, sitting at the head table, leaned toward his own microphone, not to be helpful, not to smooth it over, but to add fuel. "At least the Army gave her something to do with her life," he said, grinning like he'd just delivered the wittiest line of the evening. More laughter. My mother didn't say a word. She just smiled, that small, satisfied smile she used to wear whenever the scorecard tilted decisively in Brooke's favor, and she took a slow sip of champagne like she was toasting the moment. I sat perfectly still. Every muscle I'd trained over 9 years of service locked into position because I have been trained, specifically and repeatedly, on what to do when the world goes sideways. You do not flinch. You assess, you secure the casualty. And my casualty was sitting right beside me. Josie's small hand found mine under the table and clamped down with a grip that told me she understood, in whatever way a 6-year-old understands cruelty, that the laughter was about her mother and, by extension, about her. She looked up at me, her chin trembling, her eyes glassy under the string lights, and she asked me the question that I will hear in my head for the rest of my life. "Mommy, did I do something wrong?" I did not cry. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think there's a version of this story where the mother breaks down sobbing and everyone watching feels a rush of sympathy, and that's not what happened. What happened is that something in my chest went cold and still, the exact stillness I feel in a triage tent when the numbers stop mattering and only the next action matters. I put my arm around my daughter. I leaned down and told her, quietly, that she had done absolutely nothing wrong, that some grown-ups say cruel things because it makes them feel bigger, and that we were going to sit here with our heads high because that is what strong people do. I was gathering our things, preparing to walk her out with whatever dignity I could manage, when a chair scraped back hard against the wooden dance floor, loud enough to cut clean through the dying edges of the laughter. Everyone turned. It was Trevor's best man, a man I had exchanged maybe 4 sentences with over the entire wedding weekend. His name was Daniel Reyes, an Army veteran himself, a former captain who'd served 2 tours and now worked as Trevor's business partner running logistics for the family's shipping company. He was standing at his seat near the head table, and the look on his face was not embarrassment or discomfort. It was the specific, focused stillness of a man who has just decided something and is not going to unmake that decision. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to, because the tent had already gone dead quiet, the particular quiet that happens right before something breaks. "I need everyone to actually listen to what just got said here," Daniel began, and his voice carried without effort across 200 seated guests. "Because I don't think you all heard it the way I heard it." He looked directly at Brooke, then at my father, then longest of all at my mother. "That woman you just called a charity case has 2 Army Commendation Medals." She held a soldier's femoral artery closed with her bare hands for 11 minutes on a base outside Kandahar until the medevac bird landed, and that soldier is alive today, has 3 kids of his own, because she didn't let go. I know that because he's my cousin. His name is Danny Ruiz, and he still calls her every Christmas to thank her. A murmur went through the crowd, uncertain, shifting. "And that kid nobody signed up for," Daniel continued, his voice tightening now, "is sitting right there, 6 years old, asking her mother if she did something wrong, because you all just spent the last 2 minutes laughing at her for existing." He shook his head slowly. "I've known this family for exactly 1 wedding weekend, and in that time I've watched every one of you treat a decorated combat veteran and her little girl like an embarrassment to hide behind a support column. I don't know what happened in this family before I got here, but I know what I just watched, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend I didn't see it." Brooke's face went white under the string lights, her hand still loosely holding the microphone she'd used to deliver her joke. "Daniel, come on. It was just," she started, but he cut her off, not unkindly, but firmly. "It wasn't just anything, Brooke. You planned that line. I heard you run it by your bridesmaids in the green room before the ceremony, laughing about how it was going to be the highlight of the night." The crowd's murmur sharpened into something closer to a collective, uncomfortable gasp. Trevor, standing beside Brooke, turned to look at her with an expression I can only describe as the exact moment a man's understanding of his own wedding cracked in half. "You told your bridesmaids that?" he asked quietly. "And it wasn't performative." I could see it wasn't performative. His hand actually dropped away from her waist. My mother finally found her voice, sharp and defensive. "Daniel, this is not your business. And frankly, I think you're overreacting to a little family joke." Daniel turned to her, and for the first time his composure cracked just slightly. Not into anger, but into something closer to disbelief. "Mrs. Colby, respectfully, I spent 2 tours in Afghanistan. I've watched men bleed out in the dirt for this country. I know exactly what a joke is, and I know exactly what it isn't. What you just called a joke was a public humiliation of your own daughter and granddaughter, timed for maximum laughs in front of 200 people, and every single one of you sat there and enjoyed it." He looked around the tent slowly, meeting eyes at table after table, and I watched grown adults, lawyers and doctors and vineyard-owning neighbors look down at their napkins one by one, the same way I'd watched relatives look away from cruelty my entire childhood. I stood up then. Not to run, not anymore. I stood up because my daughter was watching me, and I needed her to see what it looked like to stand up straight in a room that had just tried to make you small. I picked Josie up, even though at 6, she was almost too big to carry, and I settled her on my hip the way I used to carry wounded soldiers' gear, weight distributed, balance controlled. I looked at my mother, then my father, then finally at Brooke, whose mascara had started to run in thin black lines down her cheeks. "I flew to Kandahar and back twice for this country," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, flat and clear the way it gets when I'm running a trauma protocol. "I have kept strangers alive with my own 2 hands. And I have spent 12 years apparently being this family's punchline for having the audacity to do it without a husband standing next to me." I looked down at Josie, whose face was still buried in my shoulder, and I felt her small body shaking. "This is my daughter. She is not a mistake, and she is not a charity case, and I am done sitting at the table you people built for me behind a column so I wouldn't ruin your photographs. I turned and walked. 12 years of dinners where I sat quietly and let comments slide. 12 years of birthday cards signed "We'll make do." All of it collapsed into the length of that walk across the dance floor, past 200 silent guests who parted without a word, past the flower arch, out into the cool Virginia night air. Josie's arms were locked around my neck, and I could feel her heartbeat slowing against my collarbone as we got further from the tent, as though her whole small body understood we were finally safe. I didn't get far. I'd made it maybe 30 yards toward the parking field when I heard footsteps behind me on the gravel, and I turned, half braced for my mother, already composing in my head the flat, steady sentence I was going to use to end the conversation before it started. But it wasn't my mother. It was Daniel, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, his tie loosened, holding a small folded card in his hand. "I'm sorry I didn't stand up sooner," he said. I should have said something the second Brooke told me she was planning that line, and I told myself it wasn't my place. He held the card out to me. It was his business card, the shipping company logo embossed in the corner, and on the back he'd scrawled a personal cell number in blue ink. "I run logistics, and I also do some pro bono consulting work for a veterans family advocacy nonprofit on the side. If your family gives you any trouble about tonight, about custody stuff, about anything, you call me." I mean that. I looked down at Josie, whose eyes were heavy but open, watching this stranger with the cautious curiosity of a kid deciding whether an adult could be trusted. "You didn't have to do that in there," I told him. "Most people don't." He shrugged, and for a second, the confident wedding toast posture dropped away, and I saw something more tired underneath it. "My little sister's a nurse, too." "I see you, back home in Ohio." I watched people talk down to her for years because she just pushes a cart around a hospital instead of doing something important. I wasn't going to sit there and watch it happen to somebody else's sister without saying a word this time. I drove Josie back to the motel that night in silence, her asleep again within 10 minutes, the porch lights of Millbrook nowhere in sight, and somewhere around the Virginia-Tennessee line, I let myself cry for the first time in longer than I could remember, quietly, so I wouldn't wake her, both hands steady on the wheel the entire time. The fallout, I learned over the following weeks, was significant. Daniel had not been the only person live streaming little clips of the wedding to family group chats. Apparently, 3 separate cousins had been posting toast highlights to a private Instagram close friends story, and Daniel's speech, unfiltered and furious, made it into at least 2 of those stories before anyone thought to stop recording. It spread through the extended family faster than any of them could contain it. Trevor's parents, mortified, sent me a private message apologizing on behalf of the entire wedding party, which I appreciated more than I expected to. Trevor himself called off the honeymoon for 2 weeks, while he and Brooke worked through what he described, carefully, as a serious conversation about what kind of family we're going to raise our own kids in someday. I don't know all the details of what was said between them, because that part isn't mine to tell, but I do know that 6 weeks later, Brooke called me. It was the first phone call, just the 2 of us, in over 3 years. She didn't apologize well at first. Her first attempt was clumsy, defensive, full of, "I was just nervous," and "you know how weddings get." I let her get it out, the way you let a patient work through the first wave of shock before the real pain sets in, and I waited. And eventually, underneath all of it, she said something that actually sounded true. "I think I've spent my whole life being told I was the winner," she said, her voice cracking. "And I never once had to ask myself what I was supposed to have won, or what it cost you." I told her I appreciated her saying that. I told her I wasn't ready to pretend the last 12 years hadn't happened, but that I was willing to let her prove, slowly, over time, that she meant it. My parents have not called. I understand now that they may never call, and I've made a strange, hard-won peace with that, the same kind of peace you make with a wound that's healed into a scar instead of skin not gone, but not bleeding anymore either. Daniel and I talked more than I expected to after that night. It started as logistics, him checking in about whether the family had caused any more trouble, whether Josie was doing okay, and slowly it became something else, something neither of us rushed. He drove out to Fort Campbell 3 months later, not for a grand gesture, just to take Josie and me to a diner off base for pancakes, and he spent 45 minutes letting my daughter explain, in exhaustive detail, the entire plot of her favorite cartoon, while he asked exactly the right follow-up questions at exactly the right moments. I watched him do that, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been clenched for a very long time. It's been almost a year now since that wedding. Josie is 7. 2 weekends ago, her school sent home an assignment. Draw the people who make up your family. I watched her sit at our kitchen table with a box of markers, chewing on her lip in concentration, and when she finally slid the paper across to show me, I had to excuse myself to the sink for a moment before I trusted my voice. She'd drawn 3 figures under a bright yellow sun. One was me, in a rough approximation of my uniform, which she always insists on getting exactly right down to the boots. One was her, holding my hand. And one, a little off to the side, but clearly, deliberately included, was a tall figure she'd labeled in careful, wobbly kindergarten handwriting. Daniel. He plays trains with me. There was no one else on the page. No grandparents, no aunt in a wedding dress, just the people who had shown up and stayed. I picked up that drawing, walked over to our refrigerator, and pinned it up with the same cheap magnet I use for everything else that matters in this house. I stood there for a second, looking at it, thinking about a tent full of people who laughed at my daughter for existing, and about one man who stood up in the middle of that laughter and refused to let it go unanswered. I used to think the hardest thing the Army ever taught me was how to stay calm while someone was bleeding out in front of me. I don't think that anymore. I think the hardest thing it taught me, the thing that actually mattered in the end, was how to walk away from people who were never going to stop hurting me, and how to recognize, quickly and without hesitation, the people who were worth staying for. My daughter taught me the rest. She taught me that family isn't the people whose last name you share. It's the people who stand up when the room goes quiet, and who keep showing up long after the string lights go dark.